Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. Good to see all of you. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to lesson 2 of our fascinating course, Colorful Profiles. Hope you enjoyed last week. Hopefully all of you received the recording, the message. Everyone got the recording? Did anyone not get the message with the recording? There was a text message or a WhatsApp that went to everyone. Okay, if you didn't get it, let me know after the class. I can make sure that you're on the right lists. Every week we send it out. You're welcome to share it with friends, family, and invite them to join us. The recording of the class. Yes, exactly. Okay. So last week, for those of you that were here, last week we had a fascinating discussion regarding 3 incredible, relatively unknown converts to Judaism. And we talked about their amazing stories, the difficulties that they went through and overcame, the contributions that they made to the Jewish world. Tonight, we'll look at the flip side of that equation. Tonight, we'll explore 3 great Jewish leaders who made incredible contributions, not just to the Jewish world, but also to the non-Jewish world. Now, obviously, there are some very important candidates that we could be focusing on, but I want to just remind you that the purpose of this course is not just to go back to the handful of familiar individuals in Jewish history who fit each category. So for tonight, for example, talk about Jews who influenced the non-Jewish world. You could think of the Rambam, Maimonides. You could think of the Abarbanel. I'm talking about from a religious perspective. Obviously, there are Jews who happen to be Jewish who accomplished amazing things for the world. But I'm talking about Jews who taught aspects of Judaism to the world. Think of Maimonides, the Abarbanel, and others. What we're trying to do in this course is to focus on the relatively unsung heroes of Judaism, and I think you'll experience that this evening. Let's just remind ourselves of the famous words of the prophet Isaiah. You have in front of you your booklets, your beautiful booklets. The famous words of the prophet Isaiah, text number 1, page 49. Isaiah says, and I'll read the text, "So said Almighty God, who created the heavens and stretched them out, spread out the earth with all that springs from it, and gave a soul to its people and life to those who walk on it. I, God, have called you with righteousness. I will strengthen your hand." He's speaking here to the Jewish people. "I will protect you, and I will set you as a covenant for all people, and a light unto the nations." I would imagine everyone here has heard of that term. The Jewish people are or lagoyim, a light onto the nations. And as the commentaries explain, this doesn't just mean Jews who happen to be Jewish who bring light to the world. People like Einstein and other great Jews who have brought amazing gifts to the world, but who specifically bring the gifts of Judaism, Jewish values, Jewish teachings, Jewish way of living to the general world. If you look in one of the commentaries on text number 2, right, what does he say? The Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, one of the great commentaries on the prophets, explains this verse as follows. The Jewish people are destined to be a light unto the nations. As the verse states, nations will go by your light and kings by the brightness of your radiance. This refers to the light of the Torah, which will issue forth to the nations from Zion. Okay, so and then he continues on the next page. Let's just finish this text because he mentioned something very important. Page 51. The commentary continues. The Jewish people will sustain the nations of the world through guiding them to observe the 7 laws of Noah and to walk in the proper path. As the verse states, multitudes of nations will go to each other and tell one another, "Come, let us ascend to the mountain of God, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways so that we may walk in his paths. For the Torah will issue forth from Zion, the word of God from Jerusalem." And as we discussed last week, Judaism is not looking to convert the entire world to Judaism, but rather to encourage each human being in their own world to be the best person that they can be and have a meaningful relationship with Hashem through fulfilling the Noahide laws, the principles of Noah, which we'll talk about in one of our stories. Okay? So with that in mind, with this principle in mind, that we are to be a light unto the nations, let us introduce our three heroes for this evening. The first of our heroes, his name is Reb Shmuel, and he's known as Reb Shmuel HaNagid. HaNagid means, in the ancient Hebrew, it means the prince. At one point, he was appointed, he was recognized as like the king of the Jews, the prince of the Jewish people. Let us delve into his fascinating story. Reb Shmuel HaNagid is born in the year 993, towards the end of the 10th century. He was born in Spain. And for those of you that are a little bit familiar with Jewish history, we know that there is a golden age of Spain. Have you heard of the golden age of Spain? The golden age of Spanish Jewry specifically. What is the golden age of Spanish Jewry? It is a very unique time when throughout the rest of the world, Jews are being persecuted in Christian Europe during the golden age of Spain, which goes from about the year 950 until 1492, when the Jews were expelled. So about 500 years. In Christian Europe, Jews are being persecuted. There are the Crusades and the terrible massacres throughout Christian Europe. There are expulsions from England, France, right? Jews in Israel are also suffering terrible persecution because of the Crusades that are coming to Israel. Jews in the Muslim world, in many places, are treated very harshly. Even in the Ottoman Empire, the Jews are being treated very harshly, or what was to later be the Ottoman Empire. In Bavel, in Babylonia, the amazing idyllic circumstances of the Jewish community have declined. And yet, during these 500 years, the Jews in Spain had a very prominent, prosperous, comfortable position among the greater population in Spain. In many ways, we can credit Reb Shmuel HaNagid for ushering in, for setting the stage for that which led to 500 years of Jewish prosperity in Spain. Who was this person? What was his story? So let's understand a little bit about Spain in the 10th century. It's not yet a country. It's not yet a single unified kingdom. If you look on page 53, you have a map of Spain around this time that when Reb Shmuel HaNagid is alive. And you have in the north, you have a number of well-defined kingdoms. In the south, there was a larger kingdom known as the Kingdom of Granada, but in many times it broke up into small warring factions of Berbers and Moors and Arabs fighting with each other, taking control of little statelets. And that's what the southern part of Spain looks like. Okay? Now, Jews go back in Spain to the time of the exile that followed the destruction of the Second Temple. When the Second Temple is destroyed in Israel, hundreds of thousands of Jews were murdered, millions of Jews were exiled by the Romans all over what was then the Roman Empire, and many Jews ended up in southern Europe, including in parts of Spain. And there they began to establish themselves under Roman rule. Things were not so easy, but once the Muslims came and took over, it was a much easier time for the Jewish people. The Muslims, although they didn't treat Jews as equals, but they treated them as a minority that was tolerated and begrudgingly accepted and respected into the population. Okay? But during the lifetime, or around the time of Reb Shmuel HaNagid, the prominence of the Jewish community in Spain is lifted up to an entirely new level. We're going to explore his life based on the writings of a great Jewish historian whose name was Abraham ibn Daud. He's known as Ra'avad, and he's known as Ra'avad the First, because in Jewish tradition there's actually 3 Ra'avads, so he is Ra'avad the First. We're going to explore a little bit of the incredible life of Reb Shmuel HaNagid. Let's turn to text number 3, page 55 towards the bottom. One of the outstanding disciples of Rabbi Chanoch ben Moshe was Rabbi Shmuel HaLevi, the Nagid, the prince, the son of Rabbi Yosef, surnamed Ibn Nagrela of the community of Cordova. I want to just point out to you, a little cliffhanger. He mentions that he was a disciple of Chanoch ben Moshe. In lesson 4 of this course, we're going to talk about captives. And we're going to touch upon the famous, incredible story of the 4 captives that changed the map of the Jewish world in the 10th century. 2 of the 4 famous captives were Rabbi Chanoch and his father, Rabbi Moshe. And they ended up in Spain. So just keep that in mind, and we'll get back to the story in lesson 4. So one of the students of these 2 rabbis was Rabbi Shmuel, who later becomes Shmuel the Nagid. Aside from being a great Torah scholar back inside and highly cultured person, Rabbi Shmuel was highly versed in Arabic literature and style and was indeed competent to serve in the king's palace. So this is a highly cultured individual, page 56. Nevertheless, he maintained himself in very modest circumstances as a spice merchant until the time when war broke out in Spain. With the termination of the rule of the house of Ibn Abi Amir and the seizure of power by the Berber chiefs, the city of Cordoba dwindled and its inhabitants were compelled to flee. Rabbi Shmuel fled to Malaga, where he occupied a shop as a spice merchant. His shop happened to adjoin the courtyard of Abu al-Qasim ibn Arif, the vizier and scribe of King Habus, the son of Maksan, the Berber king of Grenada. The term vizier means like the second in command to the king. Very often the kings were people of great personality, charismatic, they knew how to relate to the people, they projected power. But when it came to being functional and to running things practically, they weren't so good. So very often the kings would bring in a talented manager who would manage the administration. And they were the ones who really had the power. Okay? So the vizier of this powerful king, who's now in charge of southern Spain, which is a large kingdom, his palace is adjacent to the spice store of Rabbi Shmuel. Okay? A viceroy, exactly. Okay? As a result, because he was a neighbor, the scribe's maidservant would ask Rabbi Shmuel to write letters for her to her master when he was away from home. She was a maidservant. She was not literate. She wanted to write letters to her master when he was traveling. And so Rabbi Shmuel, the neighbor, the Jewish neighbor who was brilliant and learned, he would write the letters. When Ibn al-Arif received the letters, he was astounded at the learning they reflected. This guy knows how to write. This guy knows what he's talking about. Consequently, when after some time the scribe was given leave by King Habus to return to his home in Malaga, he asked the people of his household, who wrote the letters that I received from you? They replied, a certain Jew from the community of Cordoba, who lives next door to your courtyard, wrote them on your behalf. The story continues, page 57. On our behalf, thank you. The scribe ordered that Rabbi Shmuel be brought to him at once. He told him, it does not become you to spend your time in a shop. From now on, you are to stay at my side. He thus became the scribe and counselor of the counselor to the king. So he became the chief of staff to the chief of staff of the king. He's now pretty powerful. The counsel that Rabbi Shmuel provided was remarkable and accurate, as if one had consulted the oracle of God. Thanks to his counsel, King Habus achieved success and became exceedingly great. Subsequently, when the scribe Ibn al-Arif took ill and felt his death approaching, King Habus paid him a visit and said to him, what am I going to do? Who will counsel me in the wars that surround me on every side? Ibn al-Arif replied, I never counseled you out of my own mind, but out of the mind of this Jew, my scribe. Look after him well and let him be like a father and a guide to you. Do whatever he says and God will help you. Accordingly, after the scribe's death, King Habus brought Rabbi Shmuel Halevi to his palace and made him his scribe and counselor. Thus he entered the king's palace in the year 4780, which is 1020, at the tender age of 27 years old. So he's 27 years old, and he now becomes, you can compare him to like the chief of staff or the national security advisor, or a combination of all these very, very high positions where you are literally controlling and you are in charge of, you're whispering into the ear of the king, you are controlling who sees the king, you're giving him military advice and political advice. He becomes a very, very powerful individual. It's fair to say that not since Joseph in Egypt was there a Jew who occupied so much power in a large non-Jewish court. Just like Joseph was given full reign, free reign by Pharaoh, Reb Shmuel HaNagid is given free reign by this very powerful king who is taking on more and more of this area of southern Spain. Keep in mind, this is a time when Jews are severely persecuted under the Christians in other parts of Europe. And even in Spain, they're begrudgingly treated as second-class citizens under the Muslims. Now, what do you think might have attracted a king to be willing to take the risk and to hire a Jew? What are some of the more positive things, besides the great recommendation from his chief of staff? What are some things that might be beneficial to having a Jew in this position? Trust, okay. Anything else? Okay, knowledge and intellect. Okay, but I don't know if the king would appreciate that. So we find in the writings a few things. It was not uncommon that the king was always wary of his second in command, because his second in command might accidentally plant a knife in his stomach and become the king, or his back, depending if he's sleeping or not, right? A Jew is not becoming the king of a Muslim kingdom. So there was no worries that Reb Shmuel has designs on the throne, right? So he felt very confident having a Jew in this position, okay? Like you said, he was highly educated. Another interesting thing is that we're dealing with a time when there are many kingdoms, many cultures, many tribes, and we're talking about all around the Mediterranean, right? And there are Jews in all of these countries. And in terms of international relations, when you have a person who's a Jew, who is trusted and can relate to Jews in all these different countries, each of whom are also perhaps in some measure of business and positions of power, the ability to interact and to have people in foreign countries that you can trust, a Jewish person has that ability because there's a certain relationship between Jews regardless of their nationality. And so as a result, we do find throughout history, there are kings who put Jews in positions of power because of this benefit. Nobody as much as Rabbi Shmuel, because we'll see his career is just getting started, but it is something that was considered very beneficial to a kingdom. Yes. True. Correct. Yes. Yes. On the negative side, I'll just repeat what you're saying. Sometimes if things went wrong, you could blame the Jew. Exactly. Okay. So he's now in a much more positive position. Okay. And as a result of the opportunities, he's doing his own business dealings and he becomes very wealthy, right? The king helped him with wealth and gave him business opportunities. And as a result, the Jewish community of Cordoba, which was the capital of the kingdom of Granada, right? At this point, this Berber king, has now pretty much united the entire southern Spain under his singular kingdom. So he is appointed as the Nagid, as the prince of the Jews, representing the Jewish people. So he is now the official head of the community, recognized by the Muslims, as well as in charge of all the philanthropic activities of the community on behalf of the Jewish people. Perhaps you could say like you have like a Jewish federation that at least in years past was doing like fundraising on behalf of the entire Jewish community, and then they were giving out money to different organizations, right? So you could say he is also like the head of the Jewish Federation. He's in charge of all the philanthropic activities. He's getting people involved and giving money and deciding who are the right causes and setting, right? So this was a very, very powerful and important position. And of course, he's using this unique role to further Jewish interests, to help the Jewish people, to keep away any harsh decrees that are perhaps coming their way. There's a lot of anti-Semites who are always cooking things up because they're jealous, because they're hateful, etc. So he's constantly involved in helping the Jewish people. And he also made it his business to put an emphasis on supporting Torah scholarship. Again, as we're going to learn in detail in lesson 4, as a result of the story of the 4 captives, the community in Babylonia, which is where Torah was centered for about 700 years, is now migrating up all around the Mediterranean to North Africa and to Southern Europe. And there are young Jewish scholars who are coming from all over. They're coming into southern Spain. There are opportunities in southern Spain, business opportunities. With Reb Shmuel HaNagid, people can live comfortably, people can feel safe from persecution. It's a very attractive place to live. And there's a tremendous need for the support of Torah scholarship for young people. And so he made it his business to put an emphasis on supporting Torah scholarship and making sure all the needs were taken care of so that Judaism and Torah could flourish in those times. Let's see in text number 4, what are some things that he did on behalf of the community. Text number 4, Reb Shmuel was appointed as Nagid in the year 1027, which means he is 34 years old, okay? He achieved tremendous good for the Jewish people in Spain, the Maghreb, which is North Africa, Africa, Egypt, Sicily, and even as far as the Academy in Babylonia and the holy city of Jerusalem. So he's using his influence to help Jews in many, many international places. He provided material benefits from his own purse for Torah students in all these countries. He also purchased many books, copies of the Holy Scriptures, as well as of the Mishnah and the Talmud, which are also considered sacred texts. Let's understand, friends, this is 400 years before the printing press. So if you want to have a copy of the Talmud, which has millions of words, 63 books, you need to pay good money to scholars to sit and write copies of the Talmud. It's expensive. It was a priceless item. And they needed many, many copies of the Mishnah, of the Talmud, and they had to be done properly. So you had to pay people who knew what they were doing, right? So he put a tremendous amount of investment into this effort. Let's just continue. Page 59. Throughout Spain and the countries just mentioned, whoever wished to devote themselves full-time to the study of Torah found in him a patron. Moreover, he retained scribes to produce copies of the Mishnah and the Talmud, which he presented to students who were unable to purchase copies themselves, both in the academies of Spain as well as in other countries mentioned. These gifts were complemented with annual contributions of olive oil for the synagogues of Jerusalem, which he would dispatch from his own estate. He felt it a tremendous privilege to illuminate the synagogues of Jerusalem from his own estate. Very interesting. We have here a page of Tractate Brachot, estimated to have been written in the 11th century in that region of the world, found in the Cairo Geniza, which we talked about last week, this incredible treasure of hundreds of thousands of Jewish manuscripts. So far, we're talking about a person with incredible knowledge, scholarship, community leadership, philanthropy, and he is the chief of staff to the king. And he's using his position to influence and to assist his brethren. Let's just review a little bit on the screen what we're talking about. So we have Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid. Rabbi Shmuel was born during the Jewish golden era in Spain. He worked as a humble spice merchant. His talents were discovered by the king's vizier. He was appointed scribe and counselor to the king of Granada. He was appointed as Nagid, the prince, to the Jewish community of Granada. And, okay, so the next thing that happened in his life, we'll get to this next thing in a second, is the king dies. The king that loved him passes away. And as was customary in those days, the king has two sons and they get into a big old fight. They are killing each other. Who's going to be in charge? Most of the military and political elite sided with the older brother. Rabbi Shmuel knew the family very well. He knew that the younger brother was much more capable and that he was beloved by the people, and he supported the younger brother. And as a result, perhaps as a result of his support, or maybe he just had divine assistance, the younger brother ends up winning the argument. And as a result, all the old guard are exiled, or they lose the top 6 inches of their body, right? The military and political elite of the previous king are all gone because they supported the wrong king. And so he is one of the only people who's left over from the previous king. And obviously the new king really appreciates the support that he gave him during the tough times. And so he is given one more very important position, and that is he becomes the military leader in charge of all the king's wars. You might think to yourself, oi, oi, a Jew becoming a soldier. It's not quite that. You have to understand the wars in those days, this was the economy, this was the energy of the country. The country is growing, the country is expanding. This is what the country is doing. So this is a major part of what this kingdom is doing. You can compare it more to a combination of the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Secretary of State, right? He's in charge of all foreign relations now because he's traveling and he's negotiating with other countries that they might go to war with or they might make peace with and make treaties, etc. And so he's given an entirely new level of power and influence in the court. Now, we have some very interesting writings of his that he wrote while he was away during these foreign trips. Again, he would go on these long trips, several months, to negotiate with foreign kingdoms and to deal with wars and battles. And he writes his thoughts and his feelings and his memories in the form of beautiful poems. Again, found in the Cairo Geniza, they discovered what we call war poems of Reb Shmuel HaNagid. And one of these very, very interesting war poems talks about a moment where he felt his life was in danger. The war went badly. He was captured by an enemy. His life was in danger. And he made a vow that if miraculously he is saved and he's able to continue living, he will devote himself to writing an important text of Judaism that will benefit the Jewish people. Let's read from, in his own words, what happened and how he felt. Okay? We're looking at page 61. This is text number 5 in English. This is written by his son. His son wrote this down. Rabbi Yosef HaNagid writes, a disastrous war erupted in the month of Iyar of the year 1049, May 1049. The disaster unfolded when the inhabitants of Malaga betrayed our forces in the mountains, and on Thursday, that was the last day of the month of Iyar, May 10th. As a result, mighty officers were killed in battle, and my father, may the exalted God bring him honor, was captured. God saved him in a remarkable and unprecedented manner. After his rescue, he made a vow to collect and compose Hilchata Gibrata, a comprehensive compendium of Jewish laws. To introduce this work, he penned the following poem, which describes the war and its deliverance, and his deliverance. I want to just speak for a moment about this book, and then we'll read the poem. For those of you that took the Talmud course, and I beg your apology if you didn't, we talked about how the Talmud was concluded in Babylonia in approximately the year 500. And when the Talmud was concluded, things were very clear. There weren't that many arguments. The Jews knew exactly what to do based on the conclusions of the Talmud. But then another 500 years go by, and we have many new situations and circumstances and things that needed clarity and new customs and new communities and difficulties. And you have 500 years of questions and answers and ideas, and it's all getting written in the Shuvot HaGaonim, the responsa of the great sages of Babylonia. The communities all over the Mediterranean would write letters to Babylonia, and we end up with a lot of confusion, and it's becoming very difficult for the average Jew to know what to do. Practically speaking, it's difficult to know how to act as a Jew from the Talmud. Again, the Talmud is very complex and very not always so organized, etc. So he decides to move away from the style of the Talmud, to create his own structure, and to write a book of clear and concise Jewish law. Now, unfortunately, this book did not survive the test of history. We don't have this book. We certainly don't have it in its entirety. We have a few pages that were discovered as part of the Cairo Geniza. We also have small selections of this book that are quoted in the works of other sages whose books did survive. So we know that the book was written and published. Had the book survived, it may have even preempted what Maimonides set out to do. Remember, about 100 years later, 150 years later, Maimonides sets out to accomplish this very same goal, to organize Jewish law in a way that is accessible to every single person. But certainly he was the first of the Spanish scholars to create this style of organizing Jewish law, and he did it as a way of thanking Hashem for the incredible deliverance that he had while he was at battle. We do know that this book, although we lost the book, inspired the works of other Spanish scholars like the Rif, Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, and the Rambam, famous Maimonides, and others. And so this was definitely a contribution to the Jewish world. Let's read his poem that he writes, thanking God for his deliverance. Okay, bottom of page 61. God has enabled me to expound on the Torah and the mitzvahs and bless me with the ability to issue rulings. Okay, so he's not just a politician. He's not just a war hero. He is a great scholar of Torah that the Spanish community is turning to for guidance. Page 62. Listen to me, therefore, you virtuous people, and hear the Torah explained virtuously. I inquire into God's rules as best I can, as far as my mind can probe. I point out the common errors to avert them and write down the proper laws to establish them. I inscribe that which is beyond dispute articulately and with clarity. I exhume every straight matter that lay buried, and I lead every distorted matter to its grave. God, protect the door of my lips and mouth from expressing foreign and misguided notions. Be with my words to help me, just as you assist me in my misfortune. Just as you recently delivered me into the hands of oppressors and they decreed death on me. Nevertheless, you showed great mercy to me while I was captured on the day of my calamity. You delivered me into their hands, but you were my mighty tower, my secure fortress. They seized me with their hands, but I was riding upon the precious clouds. They rushed to kill me with arrows like fiery flames, with spears like strong beams. They thought they could kill me with these weapons, but behold, their hands were tied behind their backs. The bands of my enemies were shamed, and my allies sang praise to the God of the universe. Therefore, on my lips and all my days and nights will be songs for the Almighty God. Who can say that the dead will not be resurrected? I am a dead man brought up from the grave. And here you see a copy from the Cairo Geniza, one page of this book that was otherwise lost to Jewish history. You see this on page 63. So just to continue up on the screen, right? He supported King Badis, who was the second son, and became his military commander. His life was saved, and he wrote Hilchata Gevirta. Very, very incredible book. Okay? So this rabbi sets the tone for Spanish Jewry, being comfortable in the general population, as well as studying their works and philosophies. So whereas perhaps Jews previously were not so comfortable studying other philosophies, he sets the tone, which is later continued by many other Spanish scholars, including the Rambam, the Abarbanel, and others. And this, my friends, is a very brief overview of the incredible story of Rabbi Shmuel Hanagid, a model for those who aspire to excellence in both religious and secular worlds without sacrificing anything. Now, just to conclude, he also had a very powerful influence on the non-Jewish world. Obviously, people were in awe of him. People respected him. He was very famous for the unique way that he dealt with his detractors. As you can imagine, there were many non-Jews, many Muslims who were jealous of him and who tried to undercut him. But instead of treating them harshly and mercilessly, as was the custom of powerful people in those days, he had a way of bringing people around to his side. The story is told, for example, that there was one Muslim advisor of the king who was incredibly jealous of him and hated him with a passion. And every time Reb Shmuel's wagon would ride through the streets, this man would shout curses. He would shout curses at the second in command to the king. One time, unbeknownst to him, the king was riding in the wagon with Reb Shmuel. And the king hears one of his advisors shouting curses at his favorite second in command. And he gets very angry. The king gets angry at this man and orders Reb Shmuel to punish him by cutting out his tongue. The tongue that had the chutzpah to curse my advisor should be taken out. Reb Shmuel did not carry out the decree. Instead, he worked very hard on befriending this person and spending time with him and bringing him around to his side. And the man was, of course, very, very grateful because he knew he had been spared from terrible punishment. And this man actually became one of his greatest supporters. And his custom was that every time Reb Shmuel's wagon would pass, he would shout blessings. He would say beautiful things about him. A couple of years later, they're riding through the marketplace again. And again, the king is in the wagon. And again, the king hears shouting, but this time he hears shouting of blessings. And he looks out the window and he sees the same guy, and he turns to Rabbi Shmuel and he says, I told you to cut out his tongue. Rabbi Shmuel smiles and says, I did, Your Majesty. I cut out his negative tongue and I gave him a positive tongue. Okay? So he had a very unique way of dealing with adversaries and dealing with his enemies. One of these enemies was a person who was an Arab poet who was known as Al-Muntafil. And this Al-Muntafil initially was an enemy of Reb Shmuel, but eventually was brought around. And he writes in his book beautiful words of praise for this great Jewish leader. Let's read this as our final text of this individual. Text number 6 on page 64. Those who count Moses among them and enjoy his light, say what you want about them, but you will not arrive at 1/10 of their qualities. How many visible marvels on earth they have accomplished, and how many generous gifts they have continuously given to people. You, Reb Shmuel Hanagid, are superior to the noblemen of the Orient and the Occident, just as gold is superior to copper in importance. If people could distinguish between doom and the right way, they only would have to kiss your 10 fingers. Thanks to you, I have won this world, and I have satisfied my wishes. And thanks to you, I long to meet the same again in the other world. I profess openly the religion which prescribes observance of Saturday when I stand before you, and when I am among my compatriots, I believe in that religion secretly. This poem, by the way, he only allowed to be published after his death. Yeah. For obvious reasons. And there was a lot of anger, and a lot of the poets of the time and the Muslim scholars came out very vehemently against him, but at this point they couldn't punish him, and his words are what they are. Tremendous praise for this great and incredible Jewish leader. Okay, so this is our first hero for the night. L'chaim. Interesting story, no? Great story, yeah. Okay, our next great Jewish leader takes us to a very different time. Whereas Reb Shmuel ushered in the golden age of Spain, our next great leader is right after the golden age of Spain has concluded. Okay, we know, of course, in 1492, the Jews were expelled from Spain. Many Jews left Spain, left everything behind, their treasure, their communities, their hundreds of years of culture and history. There were, of course, Jews who remained behind and practiced Judaism secretly. And many of the Jews who escaped went to neighboring Portugal that was still friendly to the Jews. Sadly, about 5 years later, Portugal too enacted a horrific expulsion of Jews from Portugal. But in many ways, the Portuguese expulsion was even worse than the Spanish expulsion. And that is because the Portuguese were not so excited to get rid of their Jews. They were very happy with what the Jews brought to their little country. And they wanted the Jews to remain, and yet they also wanted to enact an expulsion. So they basically said to the Jews, you have to leave. And when they tried to leave, they would force them to stay and they would persecute them. The children were kidnapped and forcibly baptized. It was a very, very difficult time. And so as a result, most Jews were unable to leave Portugal. And so many more of the Portuguese Jews ended up remaining in Portugal as what's known as conversos, the hidden Jews, practicing Judaism in secret and professing to be devoted Catholics in public. It was a very, very difficult time for the Jewish people. There was a man, his name was Gaspar Rodriguez Núñez. He was arrested in the year 1596 in Portugal. So this is over 100 years after the expulsion, about 100 years after the expulsion from Portugal. And he is tortured by the Inquisition. They're trying to get him to admit that he's a Jew and to divulge the names of others who are part of the Jewish community. And we actually have the records of the Inquisition themselves describing what they did to him. I will tell you what we're going to read now has a lot of redactions. The really horrific parts are left out. You are able to read it in the original, and it's very, very challenging. But let's read text number 7. As Gaspar Rodriguez Núñez sat in his cell waiting for his 4th session with the Lisbon Inquisition, he was in excruciating pain. His 3 previous stints on the rack and the hoist had seriously damaged his 39-year-old body. These are torture implements that the Inquisition would use. During the first round of torture on August 28, 1596, Gaspar defended his innocence The torturer was directed to apply more pressure. After a month to reflect on his offenses and to heal somewhat, Gaspar was once again subjected to this cruel examination, despite the fact that the first torture had not been properly carried out because of the mishap which Gaspar seemed to have suffered, also known as a horrible dislocated shoulder that wasn't healed properly. Apparently, he had fainted and his limbs swelled up, so the session ended prematurely. Still, he confessed nothing. On the third occasion, the inquisitors decided that hanging him by his arms, tied behind his back, might be a more effective technique. This time, Gaspar did indeed confess. He said that while he had been baptized as a child and lived outwardly as a Catholic for decades, he was a Jew and had believed in the law of Moses for the last 16 or 17 years. The Lisbon authorities were not satisfied with Gaspar's confession. It seemed that he had not named enough names, and so yet another torture session was scheduled for early February 1597. It was now almost 4 years since Gaspar's arrest, and he was a broken man, both mentally and physically. Gaspar told his examiners that his arms were in a bad way, and that he would not be able to withstand further torture. In light of this, the members of the Holy Tribunal decided that this was enough. Gaspar Rodriguez Nunez, maimed in his right arm and hand and his body covered with lesions, was released from prison on February 27th. He was ordered to appear at the Auto de Fe in Lisbon, where he would be reconciled with the church. He was forced to give up all of his property, accept a form of house arrest, attend Mass regularly, and wear the San Benito, which was a sign of people who were confessing their sins against the church, to wear the San Benito outside the home. He was one of the lucky ones, because many of the Jews who were caught by the Inquisition were burned at the stake. He was one of the ones that they allowed to live, but to live under very, very difficult circumstances. So Gaspar is released from prison. And shortly after his release, a couple of years later, he and his wife give birth to a child who they name Manuel. Shortly after Manuel's birth, a couple of years later, they decided this is not a place to raise a Jewish child, and they had nothing to lose. They had already given up all their property, and they escaped from Lisbon, they escaped from Portugal, and they moved to Amsterdam. Amsterdam was one of the few places in Europe during that time where Jews were welcome to live, and to live as Jews openly in public. You may recall last week some of the converts that we learned about went for their conversions. They went to Amsterdam. Amsterdam was a place that was very, very friendly to Jews. So they're living in Amsterdam. It's much more tolerant there. You can live openly as a Jew. Gaspar became Yosef. Manuel became Menashe. They took on the Jewish last name Ben Yisrael. And this is our next hero, Rabbi Menashe ben Yisrael. I'm sorry? Yeah. He's the son of this Jewish person who was tortured by the Inquisition. Absolutely, he's Jewish. And so he grows up with this incredible trauma of his father having been horrifically tortured by the Inquisition. You could imagine he would be very hateful and angry and not looking to interact much with the non-Jewish community. But what we find actually is we have an individual who is very, very wise, very knowledgeable, not just knowledgeable in Jewish texts, but also in general knowledge and secular texts, and not just interested in being with the Jewish world, but very interested in influencing the non-Jewish world as well. In a sense, his response to his father's experiences was to try to change the non-Jewish world, to try to influence the non-Jewish world and to take away some of the hatred, to try to theologically and intellectually wrestle with the hatred, with the anti-Semitism of the time. And in many ways, he found a measure of success. Let's see what happened, okay? He is growing up in Amsterdam. His teacher is an incredible rabbi from Morocco who teaches him diligently. This rabbi is the rabbi of one of the synagogues in Amsterdam, and at the age of 18, his teacher passes away, and he, at the age of 18, is appointed as the successor as the rabbi of the synagogue. He opened up a printing press, the very first printing press of Jewish books in Amsterdam. Again, the printing press at this point is about 150 years old, but in Amsterdam, there was no printing press for Jewish books. Now, he saw a need not just for classic Jewish books, but Amsterdam was filled with conversos, with people who had lived for 100 years or so undercover in Spain and had escaped, but had lived for several generations without being able to properly learn about Judaism. And so you had children who were maybe told once or twice a year that they're Jewish, but nothing else. And it was very difficult for them to be part of the Jewish community. They weren't well versed in Hebrew. They weren't knowledgeable of basic Jewish texts. Okay, so he felt a tremendous. He felt empathy for these brethren of his who grew up like him in an environment to no fault of their own where they weren't able to learn Judaism properly. And so he saw the need to print books in Spanish on behalf of his Jewish brethren, Spanish and Portuguese, depending if they were Portugal or Spain, on behalf of his Jewish brethren who, like him, had come from these countries. Okay? So early on, he prints a book, which we have today. We have a copy of this book. It's called Thesosuro dos Dinim, which is an anthology of Jewish laws, a small booklet, a pamphlet, like Judaism 101 for beginners, Judaism for beginners. But he also widened his perspective, and he decided to take on the tremendous amount of confusion and hatred that was coming from the Christian theologians against Judaism. He writes a book called El Conciliator, or The Conciliator. I think there's a copy of it. If you look on page 69, we see a copy, the front cover of this book, printed in 1633. Okay? Now, the purpose of this book was to reconcile what seems to be contradictions in the Torah that were used by the Christians to argue against Judaism. They would point to things in the Torah that didn't make sense, and they would argue, therefore Judaism is wrong, therefore Judaism doesn't make sense, therefore Christianity is correct, therefore the rabbis are making it up, etc. So he writes a book to counter all of the arguments of the Christian theologians. And this book went wild. It went viral, as we say. In 1633, it went viral, okay? It became incredibly popular. It was translated from Spanish to Portuguese, and eventually was also translated by Rabbi Menashe himself into Latin. Latin, of course, was the language of the Christian scholars. And it became like the secret pamphlet that they would keep under their beds, that they would read in the priests. So we're all reading this book and being affected by his arguments on behalf of Judaism. Again, we have a copy of this book. This book is available. Let's look in text number 8, where he writes his motivation for writing this incredible book. I want to just mention to you, and I think this is very important to mention at this point. We're going to learn amazing things that this Rabbi Menashe accomplished, Menashe ben Israel. Sadly, he passed away after having experienced the death of more than one of his children, and he had no descendants. He died a broken man without descendants. Our sages tell us, meaning he had no living, his children had no children, he had no grandchildren, there's nobody alive that comes from him. Our sages tell us that the deeds of the righteous, the good deeds of the righteous, are their children. And so I feel like one of the ways you honor someone is by talking about their family. When we're talking about what he did for the Jewish people, we're honoring him and we're mentioning his children. So let's just, think about that as we read this very, very incredible story. Okay? Let's read text number 8, where he talks about why he wrote this book. Page 68. I conceive that my work will be acceptable to the learned, for if duly examined, we shall find that the study and lecture of the Talmud were not considered unimportant. By the way, in those days, for some reason, a double negative was even better than a positive. Not considered unimportant was a humble way of saying very, very important. Okay? Mucho importante, as they say. Okay. Some of the present questions were asked by the Alexandrians of Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania, an illustrious and learned sage, as stated in the Gemara Nida. So he says, I'm going to start with questions that the Talmud talks about, that the Greeks posed to the Talmudic sages. Let's start with that. We also learn from Brachot, Chulin, and other parts, these are tractates in the Talmud, that some heathen princes mooted similar doubts to the ancients, who as disciples of the prophets could alone interpret and solve many passages from which their difficulty would otherwise have been unintelligible. No little honor will accrue from it to the Hebrew nation and the sages of Israel. Again, a double negative. Okay, much honor, as the knowledge and intelligence they possessed will clearly be seen in this work. And so he just wants to bring honor and bring out the truth of what truly exists in the Talmud. Again, what was the Christian argument then? The Talmud is silly and superstitious and hateful and ridiculous. So let's talk about the wisdom, the intelligence, the beauty of Judaism, but not just for Jews. Let's bring it to the general world. Okay? Another interesting thing that he mentions, he wrote a book on basic Jewish beliefs. It's called the Book of Resurrection. And so he mentions there the responsibility that we have to share the 7 Noahide principles with the entire world. Let's look at text number 9. This is a letter that he wrote because he sent this book to all the non-Jewish leaders with whom he had a relationship. There were many priests and Christian leaders and secular leaders with whom he had a relationship. He sent them all a copy of his book with a cover letter. So this is a quote from the cover letter that he sent with his book. In the same way, great Lord, that in any well-governed republic, the subjects are given laws under which to live. Being God, the architect and supreme creator of the universe, it must be believed infallibly that he has constituted laws for his subjects and creatures. Because otherwise, how could the world be sustained? Or what way would there be to live among men if they were not governed by divine command? Thus we believe that he has given to all nations the 7 precepts, which are called the laws of sons of Noah, who are all over the world, and these are not to idolize, not to kill, not to adulterate, not to steal, not to curse in the name of God, not to eat meat of living animals, and to establish judges who enforce the laws. Also to the children of Israel, whom he chose as his people, he further established the law of Moses, containing 613 precepts. So he mentions over here the famous 7 laws of Noah, the 7 principles, starting, of course, with the belief in one God, which gives credence to the idea of absolute morality, that you can't just decide what is right and wrong based on your feelings at the moment, but there is what later becomes known as like natural law, right? The universe says this is what's right and wrong. The universe, in this case, being God. Respecting family life, a very, very important component of human beings living together. Respecting human life, respecting other people's property, respecting animal life, not to be cruel to animals, and to enforce these laws with judges and courts that are not corrupt. Now, many people think, okay, so the Jews have 613 mitzvahs and the non-Jews have 7 mitzvahs. It's actually a mistake to think of it that way, because it's not really 7 mitzvahs. It's 7 principles. But if you were to categorize our 613 mitzvahs under those principles, you actually would end up with about 250 mitzvahs that are obligatory upon the entire world. Because, for example, the entire world is forbidden from worshiping idols. Within the laws of idol worship is about 50 mitzvahs, 50 details. The part of establishing courts of justice is all the mitzvahs that are connected with having courts that are not corrupt, taking care of the poor, right? How we treat animals. There are many, many mitzvahs that are involved in these laws. And so he made it his business to share this with the rest of the world. It's interesting. The Rambam Maimonides in the 11th century writes that we have an obligation as Jews to influence the world to keep their laws. But in most cases, throughout Jewish history, it was hard enough to survive just being a Jew, right? Just staying alive as a Jew was difficult. To think about risking your life and trying to influence others, that was already very, very dangerous. Reb Shmuel did it. He was a rare exception during those times. He lived in Amsterdam. He was able to. But in our times, the Lubavitcher Rebbe argues that in the Western world, where we have religious freedom, we actually have an obligation to once again reach out as much as we can and influence our non-Jewish neighbors with the 7 principles of Noah. What's interesting is that as a result of these writings, he developed a close relationship with many of the great thinkers of that time, including those who gave birth to some of the ideas that eventually became the basis for the philosophies of the founding fathers of America. Let's understand a little bit who some of these people are. If we look for a second at text 11, Okay? Some of his influence upon famous scholars of the time. Several eminent Christian scholars, all of them Christian Hebraists. Christian Hebraists are Christians who believed very strongly in studying and understanding the original Jewish texts in Hebrew. Okay? Evinced an extraordinary interest in Noahide law. Menashe was in contact with two such scholars, Hugo Grotius and Peter Kunis, and was undoubtedly familiar with a third, John Selden. These scholars had rediscovered, as it were, in rabbinic and Old Testament sources, an ancient model for governance. One they believed to be something resembling, if not constituting, an ancient articulation of natural law. Natural law being something which is absolute. It's not just every society gets to decide what's right and wrong. There are certain, we believe these things to be self-evident, right? Sounds like the opening words of the Constitution. Self-evident by whom? Well, natural law. What is natural law? Natural law ultimately leads back to a God-given law, because only God can create something which is absolute. If it comes from man, it's relative. It depends on your thoughts and feelings in the moment, okay? Cuneus associated Noahide law with something like natural law in his work of 1617. I'm not going to pronounce it. Grotius did the same in his work of 1625. In 1640, the Christian Hebraist John Selden published his De Jure Naturale, an entire work that takes as its premise that Noahide law and the law of nature are one and the same. Okay? Selden cited Menashe as an authority. So very interesting, he's having an influence on the philosophers and scholars of the time, who, by the way, go on to influence. The students of these scholars are people like John Locke and James Harrington, who we know are quoted extensively in the writings of Thomas Jefferson and others of the founding fathers. So this individual, this little Jew who was born as a converso in Portugal, is now having an influence upon so much of the history of the world. Another interesting person with whom he had a close relationship was the famous artist Rembrandt. Rembrandt lived in his neighborhood, and Rembrandt was very impressed with this worldly Jewish scholar. They became close friends. You may be familiar with this painting of Rembrandt. Let me just bring it up over here. Okay, so let's just review some of the history here. Up on the screen, Spanish expulsion, 1492, many fled to Portugal. The Portuguese expulsion in 1497. Gaspar Rodriguez Nunez was tortured. He fled to Amsterdam with his family. Menashe ben Yisrael is his son. He spreads Judaism's universal message through written works. He opened a printing press for ex-converso Jews. He authored a number of books, including The Conciliator, The Seven Noahide Laws, which we talked about. Responsibility. We have a responsibility to promote, and it's a moral framework within a divine origin. The picture on the left is a famous Rembrandt, which he calls the man, and many people argue that this is actually a portrait of his friend, Rabbi Menashe. Okay, looks like him, huh? Okay. Now, another proof that scholars bring of their close relationship is the one on the right. Anybody recognize the one on the right? What's going on in the picture on the right? Have you ever heard of? It's a little bit hard to see on. Have you ever heard of the expression, he saw the writing on the wall? Where does that expression come from? That expression comes from the book of Daniel. Daniel was a prophet of Israel who was an advisor to the Babylonian king Belshazzar. Belshazzar made a party to celebrate the destruction of the Jewish temple. At the party, Daniel was there. He was a Jewish advisor who was forced to be there. A hand came out of the wall and wrote a message in Hebrew. Nobody in the room understood the message except for Daniel. And Daniel interpreted the message to mean that you will be destroyed by your enemies. You will be overthrown by the Persians and the Medes, the two great kingdoms of that time. And this is a painting painted by Rembrandt called Belshazzar's Feast, where he sees the hand doing the writing on the wall. Okay? This is where the expression comes from. He saw the writing on the wall. That night, by the way, the Persians invaded. They killed Belshazzar. They overthrew the Babylonian Empire, which never existed again. It now became the Persian Empire. A couple years later, we had the Purim story, just to share with you a little bit of that history, okay? Now, There is a massive dispute in the Talmud. What was it about the message that made it so hard for them to interpret? Meaning it's Hebrew letters. Okay, but there were people in Babylonia who read Hebrew. Daniel wasn't the only person who reads Hebrew. So some of them say that it was written in a script that wasn't familiar at that time to most people. Some people say that it was written instead of left to right, it was written right to left. So they were confused. Rabbi Menashe ben Yisro, one of the rabbis, writes in one of his books a very simple explanation. He says it was written instead of a cross, it was written vertically. And therefore, nobody could interpret it. Only Daniel figured out what it was. Now, Rembrandt, when he paints this, whose version does he paint? Rabbi Menashe's version. He paints the code from top to bottom. Mene, sakal, uprasin. Mene, sakal, uprasin is the code that was written at that point, which means that he was at least familiar with the opinion of Rabbi Menashe, which is a unique opinion, different than all the sages. And most likely he consulted with his friend and said, I'm going to do this painting. How should I write the Hebrew letters? Rabbi Menashe said, well, this is my opinion. This is how you should write it. Very interesting that Rembrandt had this relationship with him. Another famous thing is that he writes a book. In one of Rabbi Menashe's books, Rembrandt actually did a one-page sketch for him of 4 different biblical scenes. You have the sketch printed on page 74 of your books. These are 4 sketches of Rembrandt that were done personally for Rabbi Menashe's book. And so he has this very unique and close relationship with the famous artist Rembrandt. Finally, if this wasn't enough, one of the many incredible things that he accomplished, perhaps the most incredible thing and the most lasting thing that he accomplished for the Jewish people, was he was very troubled by the plight of Jews all over Europe. And it was not realistic for the entire Jewish Europe to move to Amsterdam. He felt it would be helpful to have more places where Jews are allowed to live. Okay? Spain wasn't really an option because Spain was very hateful, Inquisition. France also was very religious, very difficult. He turned to England. England at that time was going through a revolution. England overthrew its king. Charles I was hung. There was a commonwealth that was established by none other than Oliver Cromwell. And he saw an opportunity that perhaps he can convince England to rescind its edict of expulsion that had been enacted in the year 1290. For 350 years, a single Jew was not allowed into England. And so he writes a book, a pamphlet. He calls it Mikveh Yisrael, the hope of Israel, where he writes many theological arguments. He writes many theological arguments, arguing on behalf of the Jewish people. Just one second. Arguing on behalf of the Jewish people. Why can't I find this? Okay, it was earlier on. Here we are. Okay. Okay. I thought there were some texts here, but there are not. Arguing on behalf of the Jewish people's right to return to the land of England, to England. Okay. He writes this book. He calls it Mikveh Yisrael, and he sends this book to Oliver Cromwell, and he sends messengers and tries to influence him. He sends some of his friendly Christian theologians, people who were admirers of his. Bottom line, Cromwell invites him to a conference in 1655 called the Whitehall Conference, where the leaders of the Commonwealth were going to gather to consider this proposal of rescinding the Edict of Expulsion from 1290. He travels to England. They have the conference. He does his presentation, and he spends 2 years in England trying to push this through. He was there with his son. His other son had passed away, but he was there with his remaining son. And sadly, while he's there, first of all, he was not successful in getting Cromwell to reverse the edict. Okay, they did not go through with it. And number two, his son tragically and suddenly passes away. He's brokenhearted, both about the failure of his effort and about the loss of his only surviving son. He takes his son and he travels back to his homeland. He travels back to Amsterdam to bury him. And shortly after his son is buried, he dies as well. He dies brokenhearted and disappointed with his failure to influence England and to help the Jewish people. Now, although he was disappointed, but his influence did help, because within a couple of years, although they did not officially rescind the decree, but they began to unofficially allow Jews to move back to England. Initially, they were allowed to come on business, travel, and once you're there for business, you got to stay over for a couple of days. And if you're coming very often for business, maybe you rent an apartment, you buy a house, and slowly but surely, more and more Jews are unofficially visiting England, moving to England. And by the way, until today, the edict has still not been rescinded, and there are hundreds of thousands of Jews who live in England, and it's a very, very prominent Jewish community. Now, there is a divine providence, a twist of hashgacha pratis of divine providence. Because thank God Cromwell did not adopt his request. Why? Because 12 years after the establishment of the Commonwealth, Cromwell was killed, and Charles II became the king. And the first thing he did was reverse all the edicts, all the rules that Cromwell had enacted were reversed. Had one of those things been Jews can come back, they would have kicked the Jews out again. Like this, unofficially, the Jews came back, and until today, that's the way it is. So clearly, he had a tremendous influence, and he helped to enable a very, very successful, prominent Jewish community, which survives today in England. And with Hashem's help, they will be very, very safe and successful. Clearly, a respected person in Jewish history, a great leader. I will share with you that he was a little bit controversial among Jewish leaders and scholars, because there were Jews living in Christian countries who felt that his efforts were putting them in danger, right? Again, he lives in Amsterdam, but how are the Jews in Italy being affected? How are the Jews in Germany and France? There weren't Jews in France, but how are the Jews in Germany being affected when there's a Jew who's influencing Christians to like Judaism? And so there was a lot of opposition during his lifetime to what he was doing, but clearly, because of the incredible things that he accomplished, especially the cherry on top, helping the Jews move back to England, he is considered a revered and respected individual. He's buried in the Netherlands. You can see a picture of his grave that is visited until today. This is the story of Rabbi Menashe ben Yisrael. And again, as I mentioned before, he did not have grandchildren, no descendants, and his good deeds are his children. May his memory be a blessing. Okay, in the few minutes that we have left, I want to get to our third incredible story. We're going to travel now back in Europe. We're going to travel to Italy, and we're going to be introduced to a man whose name was Rabbi Ovadia Sforno. Has anybody heard of Ovadia Sforno? Well, there's a wine called Sforno. Ovadia Hager was last week. This is a different person. Ovadia Sforno is probably best known among Jewish circles for his commentary on the Torah. Okay, let me show you the Sforno. Exactly, he's known as the Sforno. Let's jump ahead for a second over here. Okay, let's go. Menashe ben Yisrael. Okay, Rabbi Ovadia Sforno. I just want to show you a picture. Let's jump ahead and I'll go back. Okay, this is a picture of a chumash. Okay, now you may recall last week we said that every chumash, which is a book of Torah, is printed with Rashi and Onkelos. So here you have Onkelos, here you have Rashi. This is called Chumash Mikraot Gedolot, which means a chumash with more commentaries. A Chumash Mikraot Gedolot has about 10, 15 commentaries that go together with each verse. So you have a couple of verses of the Torah here. Can you see my pointer? Not really. Okay. On the right side, you have a couple of verses of the Torah. On the bottom and on the left side is all the commentary of on the Torah. The Sforno is one of these commentaries. The Sforno is a commentary that brings many moral lessons from the verses of the Torah. I'm not sure if you can see it. It's a little bit small, but the Sforno is on the left side, left column. left page, left column, second to the bottom. Right over here is the Seforno. Okay? This is perhaps what he's most known for. But what we're going to focus on is not just what he did for the Jewish world, but what he did to influence the non-Jewish world as well, because that, of course, is our focus. That's our theme for this evening. Let's talk a little bit about his biography. Okay? He's born in the year 1475. Let's go back a little bit. He's born in the year 1475 in Italy. His family had actually grown up in Spain. There was a pogrom in Spain in 1391, and they fled to Italy. So even in the golden age of Spain, there were pogroms, right? A Jewish golden age has pogroms, right? Okay. He was born in 1475 in northern Italy. His father, Yaakov, was a scholar and a very wealthy businessman. He himself was a scholar of Torah, as well as mathematics, philosophy, and linguistics. We know that he attended medical school, and he received a doctorate from university in the city of Ferrara in Italy in the year 1501. He then moved to Rome, and then finally to Bologna, Italy, and he died in the year 1150 at the age of 75. Again, best known for his commentary that he wrote on the Torah. Okay, but what we're going to try to focus on is some of the influence that he had upon the non-Jewish world. There were many individuals in Italy, which is a much more Christian and harsh environment. But there, again, at this time, the philosophy of the Hebraists is starting to bubble up within the Christian world. Hebraists means Christian scholars who want to learn the Old Testament from the original. They want to examine it from the original. One of these Hebraists was a Christian German Catholic scholar whose name was Johann Ruchlin. Johann Ruchlin. And he wanted to learn Torah in the original Hebrew. At some point, he ends up in Rome on a mission from the king. And there he is introduced to Rabbi Ovadia Seforno, who was very knowledgeable in the sciences. He was a doctor, so he was very respected by the Christian world. And he asks the Seforno if he can hire him to teach him Hebrew and to teach him some of the basic Jewish books. And they spend a lot of time together studying Hebrew, studying Judaism. They learned a lot of books of Jewish philosophy. We know that they studied together Moreh Nevuchim, Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. And Johann Ruchlin is very much impacted by his studies of Torah with the Seforno. Okay, let's read a little bit about, by the way, you have here on page 77, you have in his original handwriting, the commentary that he wrote on the Chumash, on the Torah, bottom of page 77. Very interesting. Okay. Let's see, where do I have this? Are there pages missing here? I feel like I'm missing something. 76, 7. Okay, here we are. Text number 12. Okay. In 1498, as ambassador of the Palatinate, Ruchlin studied Hebrew under the renowned Jewish scholar Ovadia Seforno in Rome. With the intensive instruction from Seforno, as well as his own efforts, Ruchlin was able to publish the first Hebrew grammar and lexicon for Christians. The book, written in Latin, is based heavily on the medieval Jewish grammar of Moses Kimchi and the famous Hebrew dictionary, the Book of Roots by David Kimchi. So he creates a dictionary in Latin of the Hebrew language for Christian scholars to study from. Now, I want to just share with you. He writes a letter to his brother, a heartbreaking letter. He writes a letter to his brother. His brother said to him, "My dear brother, why are you studying Hebrew? What's going on over here?" So he writes like this. He says, the Jews are being persecuted in Europe. They were expelled from England. They were expelled from Spain. They were expelled from France. They're being persecuted in the Holy Roman Empire, which includes Germany and a whole bunch of other countries. Hebrew is going to disappear. This is what he says, a prediction. Hebrew is going to disappear. The Jews are going to disappear. This is his prediction of history. And so I want to save the treasure of Jewish scholarship by preserving the Hebrew language for the Christian world. This is what he writes, okay? He wanted to learn and teach Catholics so this treasure would not be lost to history. As a result, he fell in love with Jewish thought. He wrote a book called The Art of Kabbalah, because he loved Kabbalah, showing how Jewish wisdom and theology solve many questions. So this Rukhlin is very much influenced by his relationship with the Sephardim. And this brings us to a very famous story. In the year 1509, there was a campaign launched by a Jewish heretic whose name was Johann Pfefferkorn. Maybe he was a Jewish heretic because he had such a last name, Pfefferkorn, okay? Anyway, his name was Johann Pfefferkorn. Just joking. That's a rough name, Peppercorn. And he became a Christian. And like many Jews who converted to Christianity, they felt the need to prove how terrible Judaism was, and that's why they left Judaism. And he would teach, he would put himself off as a Talmudic scholar with tremendous knowledge of Judaism. And he would give lectures about how horrific and horrible the Talmud was, how it says terrible things about the Christians and about the Christian founder. And basically what he ends up proposing is that the Holy Roman Empire, which by the way includes the following countries in those days: Germany, Austria, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, the Czech Republic, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, much of Italy, parts of France, Denmark, and Poland. Okay? So again, Jews are not allowed in England, France, and Spain, and now something's going to be decreed in all of these countries. What did he propose? To ban all Jewish books from the Holy Roman Empire because of how much they denigrate Christianity, and eventually to expel the Jews from the Holy Roman Empire. This was the plan. And they got together and they had a committee, and the committee decided that he's right, and this is what we're going to do. Okay, let's remember, this was less than 100 years after the printing press was invented. Books are very, very precious. Books are very, very rare. And as much as Jews were expelled from country after country after country, Judaism was not destroyed because of our books, because of our knowledge, because of our values, because of our traditions. Could you imagine the destruction that this would cause to the Jewish people? It was a horrible, horrible decree. This was a terrible danger to the Jewish future. Okay, just look for a second at the map on page 78. You'll see what is encompassed by the Holy Roman Empire, what was under this decree. Okay, this is in the year 1509. Basically, all of Central Europe and most of Western Europe was already off limits to Jews. So we're talking about a very, very serious decree. Rukhlin, remember Johann Rukhlin, who had been influenced by the Sepharno, he decided to fight back. He's a Christian scholar, and he writes a book. He writes a pamphlet. He puts out a publication showing how this Pfefferkorn, first of all, doesn't know what he's talking about. And he's an ignoramus. And really Judaism is beautiful. And it has so many beautiful teachings. And it has so many amazing ideas. Just to quote to you one thing that he writes in this book, okay? He writes as follows, and I quote, "Everything the Jews have," listen to this, "everything the Jews have, both their revelations and their discoveries, have been published by foreign plagiarisms committed by the Greeks and then the Romans. We have nothing glorious in our philosophy that was not originally Jewish, even though in our age the glory they deserve is taken from them, and now everything of theirs is held in the lowest regard." Okay? So he writes very, very vehemently and very vigorously what a tragedy it would be, not for the Jewish world, what a tragedy it would be for the Christian world, for these books to be banned and for these books to be destroyed. Let's read a little bit about what happened over here. Abrahmanis, turn it off. Text. You want to go outside and take care of it, Irving, please? Thank you. Text 13, page 79. An unprecedented attack on Judaism began in earnest in 1509. The goal of the 1509 persecution was to weaken and break the surviving Jewish communities in one comprehensive effort by confiscating and destroying every Jewish book except the Hebrew Bible, thereby making it impossible to practice the religion properly. This aggressive strategy, carefully formulated to be compatible with imperial law, was initially spearheaded by Johannes Pfefferkorn, a recent convert to Christianity. Implementation of the new policy began in September 1509 in Frankfurt am Main, home to one of the three most prominent Jewish communities in Germany, the other two being Worms and Regensburg. So they actually started doing it. In one city, they destroyed every single Jewish book. Despite strong resistance from Jewish leaders, a complete confiscation in Frankfurt was carried out by April 1510, and other Rhineland communities, including Worms, also suffered confiscations in 1509 and 1510. Text 14, Ruchlin fought back. The emperor issued a new mandate on the 6th of July in 1510 that required legal and theological evaluations of the confiscation policy from 4 universities and 3 individual scholars, including Ruchlin. Basically, the Jews used every one of their influences to try to stop this decree. So the emperor said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to make a committee. We're going to get a bunch of scholars together. It's going to be people from 4 universities and 3 individual scholars. So we're going to have 7 opinions, essentially, and then we're going to see what everyone comes up with. While all the other experts submitted enthusiastic endorsements for implementing the new policy, to everyone's astonishment, Ruchlin argued against Maximilian's tactic, forcefully contending that the book confiscation did not accord with imperial law and was not justified on religious or theological grounds. He carefully elaborated this defense in an extensive legal analysis he sent to the emperor in October 1510 and then published in 1511. Although his conclusion stood alone among the 7 evaluations, Ruchlin's defense was so powerfully argued that it effectively stymied the new and dangerous potent method of persecution. As far as we know, all the books were returned to their Jewish owners, and despite determined efforts, the strategy was never again attempted in early modern Germany. So we have an amazing thing. We have a non-Jewish scholar is fighting against a former Jew who converted to Christianity in order to save Jewish books. Who inspired him? Well, certainly one of the people that inspired him was his relationship with Rabbi Ovadia Saforno, who studied with him and had a tremendous influence upon him. By the way, not only was he successful, but he managed to influence the emperor to enact the following. Every German university had to have a library for Hebrew books, and these books would be supplied by Jewish publishers as they were published. So every German university for the next few hundred years, every time a Jewish book was published, a copy of it would be sent to one of these German universities. Okay? Truly, truly an incredible moment. By the way, he wasn't treated very kindly by his brethren in the Christian world. He was actually charged with heresy. He was brought before the inquisitorial court, but ultimately they declined to prosecute him. Okay? In one of the writings of a German German Jewish rabbi of the time, he writes very, very powerfully. He calls this an absolute miracle. Look at text 15. In the year 1510, enemies and renegades rose up against our people, seeking to destroy our Torah books. God showed us a miracle within a miracle as non-Jewish scholars countered our oppressors and returned the Torah books to their former glory. So we have learned 3 incredible stories, 3 amazing individuals, Jewish people who were not afraid to go out into the world to teach, to inspire, to influence, to make a difference. And of course, we are inspired to do the same in our lives as well. I want to just spend a few minutes that we have left to share with you a more modern story, a modern version of the Jewish people being a light upon the nations. This is a famous story that you may have heard of. I'm going to jump ahead over here and we will watch this beautiful video. And with that, we will conclude. Let's jump ahead. Okay, the Saforno. 1 second. Okay. I just want to make sure that I share the sound with our friends on Zoom. Hold on, let me make sure to do that, and I'll get right back to you.
It started around 8 o'clock.
Explosion boomed into the night. Spectacular. General
Still burning.
You can still see the orange glow.
There's just no way to quantify this.
On December 11th, 1995, at 8 p.m., a boiler exploded in the largest textile factory in America at the time, the Malden Mills. It burnt the entire factory to the ground. The fire was so big, it could be seen from miles away, and it took an entire week to put out the fire completely. At the time, Mr. Aaron Feuerstein, the owner, the CEO of the company, was celebrating his 70th birthday. In the middle of the party, one of the executives ran over to him and said, Mr. Feuerstein, there's a fire at the mill. By the time he got there, the factory that had been built by his grandfather in the early 1900s was mostly gone, which meant that overnight, 3,000 employees who worked at Malden Mills lost their job. As far as Mr. Feuerstein was concerned, he was about to collect close to $500 million from the insurance company. He was faced with the following decision. Either close the company and pocket the money, or he can rebuild the company down south and hire cheaper labor over there and still make a lot of money. Either choice would have been common practice amongst CEOs at the time. Everybody expected for Mr. Feuerstein to do the same. The next morning, Mr. Feuerstein called a press conference. Thousands of people were crammed and jammed into this huge auditorium. Senators, politicians were there. And in front of everyone, he gets up and he makes this stunning announcement. He pledged to rebuild the factory right here in Massachusetts, bigger and better than ever before. And not only that, he continues and he says, every single one of you will continue receiving your monthly paychecks until it's rebuilt.
All our employees will be paid their full salaries.
The entire place erupted. There was so much emotion. It was charged because people were so anxious and nervous up to that point, thinking they lost their livelihood. And all of a sudden, the saint of a man gets up and he pledges and he promises that they have nothing to worry about. News media outlets showed the footage of him making the announcement, and they also showed people waiting online afterwards to pick up their paychecks. It made national and international headlines.
You'll receive your bonuses and everything today.
He was interviewed by dozens of news media outlets, and they asked him, they said, why would you even do that?
My father, who was a very observant Jew, taught me, and I still remember his quotation, which was, Bimkom she'ein anoshim, in those circumstances where there is a moral vacuum, hishtadel lios ish, do everything within your power to be a man. And that's what he instructed his children to do, and that's what I'm trying to do.
The President of the United States, Bill Clinton, in 1996, invited him to the State of the Union and sat him next to the First Lady and honored him, calling him periodically afterwards to ask him for business advice, recognizing that here was a man who didn't see money as the end of it all, as the bottom line.
Some might have said the proper business decision for a 70-year-old guy is to take the $300 million in insurance and retire.
And what would I do with it? Eat more? Buy another suit? Retire and die? Huh. No, that did not go into my mind. That was not an option, not for a second.
I was only 14 years old when this happened. But recently, when I heard about it again, I wondered, is Mr. Feuerstein still alive? Can I interview him? Can I meet him? And maybe even can I get a blessing from a great man like that? I made some calls, and I found that he lives in Brookline, Massachusetts. He's alive and well. He hasn't given an interview in 25 years. He said yes. I took along my 12-year-old son, Shalom. We traveled to Boston. We came to the house of his granddaughter, Marika Feuerstein. He lives with his granddaughter, 95. Not a young man anymore, but completely healthy and completely with it. As I walked into his home and shook his hand, I can see in his eyes the wisdom, the life experience. And I was really excited to sit and talk with him. The first question I asked him, I said, Mr. Feuerstein, what gave you the courage, the strength to walk away from hundreds of millions of dollars and do what's right and treat the workers properly like human beings, take care of them?
First of all, the Torah. As a young man, when I read and studied the Torah, that showed me the way of life. That was very, very important. Lo sa shok soche, not to oppress the worker. You got a lot of workers, not to oppress the worker, because he's an oni and an evion. We considered him a human being, not a pair of hands. And there's a difference.
He said my father was a great example. He was a big tzaddik. He also taught me to be a mensch.
My father was a tzaddik and had great influence over me. Today we see orthodoxy prospering, but when my father was a young man, orthodoxy was dying. And my father was the one who kept the Orthodox alive in Boston. The business was started by his father, Henry Feuerstein. He came over to this country in his teens, and he read in the Forward's Yiddish newspaper that there was a factory for sale in Malden. He went to see the factory. He knew nothing about knitting machinery, nothing about sweaters, nothing about anything, any product. He said, there's a place where I can go to shul, I'll be my own boss, and he bought it. And the business prospered, and by the time I got to the business, the Malden Knitting Mills was ranked AAA1 for credit, and they were worth millions.
I asked him about the...
Okay, so we'll just jump ahead over here. Next week, we will explore and discover the lives of 3 incredible and unique Jewish women in our history who were way ahead of their times, taking incredible leadership roles and changing the destiny of our people. Please join us. I'm looking forward to seeing you. Have a wonderful evening. Sei gesund. Yes.
This is Portugal. They were reconciled that a lot of he was fortunate because a lot of them didn't get that. Letters of Inquisition.
Yeah.
Pointed of reconciliation for the first time they confessed. The second time, after they were reconciled, all the people who were in the state that were had already been reconciled. It was the second time that they were put to
Caught again.
I
Okay.
took a whole course on the Inquisition.
Thank you.
And the dual Inquisition actually laid that out. But also used for prosecution and lost their Morenos and Cabrera.
Right.
But the reconciled.
Thank you.
Going to your place. Second time, instead of reconciling, they called